Hi everybody, welcome to my home. We're going to talk about basic model making today. We're going to start with essential materials, tools, and some basics of good cutting and gluing. We're also going to look at standard joinery and some of the basic ideas of creating physical objects. Materials, just like anything else, are one of those things that you have the things that you want and the things that you need and the things that would be really nifty if you had them. So we're going to talk about first your basics of what you actually really need, which is right up here, and then extra things that could be useful, and then some really cool things that if you had them, it can make your life a lot easier. Your very basic things is you need something to cut with, something to cut, something to stick it together. That's really it. Everything else is all supplementary. So when we talk about you need something to cut, usually what we're doing is that we want a slew of basic materials, things that you start with that are very useful and you can use over and over again to make any type of model that you really want, but they're contingent on what you want to make. So some of the most common elements to making models is crescent board or mat board, and these come in much larger sheets like this, but I have them here to just kind of show you a better, cleaner example of what these items are. And I've cut these small pieces so that you can see them. But depending on what you're doing, you can use a lot of other materials like cardstock, which is just a thicker paper, or Bristol board in order to get a very thin thickness of something. You can also use something like acetate or plain transparencies to get transparent material. You have crescent board, which is your standard model making material, but honestly you can also use mat board, which is very similar in density and thickness, and these are both things you can find at craft stores and online. They usually come in large sheets and you can cut them down. They also come in different finishes, or you can go with chipboard, which if you're doing the 1/16 thickness is about the same as crescent board. These also come in mat board, and they also come in other varieties. So you want to try and aim for 1/16 of an inch. That's a very convenient thickness, which is easy to cut and holds its shape well. We're still going to have to reinforce it so that when we paint it, it doesn't warp, but this is very helpful. We also have foam core. We usually use 1/4 inch foam core, although it comes in other thicknesses, and quite often we use it in black with a black core. This is because we use it a lot to make theaters, and that means that we want it to be black through and through. We also use white foam core for any other rough model making situations and the like, but these are the two that you're going to use with the most frequency. You need something to mark with. So either a pencil that you can sharpen really sharply so that you get a very accurate line, or you can use any slew of other marking utensils. It's really up to you as to what you're using. You also want something to measure that marking with. Now I'm showing you this tiny little architecture scale ruler because it's adorable. I also have a large one, but I have used this one so much that the 1/4 inch is a little bit broken up. A metal one is nice just because you can get a really clean edge marking next to it, and having a little one on hand I find useful. But any of these tools that I have a little version of, I also have a big version of. So for example, this little 6-inch corkback ruler I really like, but I also have a 12-inch one. I have an 18 and a 24 for cutting large pieces of material or small strips off of large pieces, but cutting into those large pieces can be difficult with a smaller ruler. One of the really important things about this corkback ruler is that it's metal and it has cork on the back. And that sounds pretty obvious, but one of the reasons is when you run your knife across it, you don't want it to cut into this metal. So the metal is very protective of you, and the cork on the back allows it not to slide around. You want to be really specific that you're getting a corkback ruler because it's safer for you when you're cutting. When cutting, you are going to use lots of extra blades. So whatever cutting implement you use, switch that, whatever cutting implement you use, whatever you choose, and there's lots of different varieties, you want to make sure you have extra blades on hand. Those extra blades will allow you to change out your blade, and a sharper blade is actually much safer than a duller blade. If you're cutting across the edge and you're pushing too hard, it will make you more prone to slipping. So you want to make sure that you have extra blades for your cutting implements, whichever one you choose. Now, I'm going to be using this one in our demonstrations, but this one is a standard hobby knife and is the standard for most model making and most model making things that you'll see. It takes a number 11 hobby craft blade, and you can buy them in packs of 50 or packs of 100, and you can change them out very frequently. When you do, you want to dispose of them not by throwing, and both blades actually, you want to dispose of them by not throwing them directly into the trash can. Usually you'll take a container of some kind or a soda can and cover the lid and put them into that can before disposing of them. If you have an actual sharps container, that's better, but making one for yourself is better than throwing it directly into your trash can. You want to make sure you have your extra blades stored safely. Storing them just loose inside of a container can also be dangerous. And that's also why we want to take our used blades and put them somewhere else. One of the reasons I prefer this knife is that it doesn't roll. I like the fact I can adjust the depth of how I want to cut. I can snap it off on these little ridges in order to get a sharp blade each time. So one of these blades is a few of these blades. I still need to change it out often, but not quite as often. And I can click it down and travel with it a little bit more easily. If you need to travel with this one, you can flip this inside out, but this will damage your blade a little bit. And it's not entirely safe because you still have this exposed bit of blade right there. So it's not ideal in that sense to transport this or throw this in your backpack. So you want to make sure that you have some sort of carrying case or travel case that's solid. I like to use some of those little pencil cases or just a plastic Tupperware container so that when I travel this item, I'm able to keep everything in my book bag and myself safe if I put my hand into that book bag. So we'll get into basics of cutting in a little bit, but those are some of the more common hobby knives. You can also use a scalpel or something else. Glue, you can use straight up regular Elmer's all-purpose glue and you'll be fine, but it does take a while to get tacky. So using something a little faster like tacky glue or some of those can be very useful, but some of them don't last super long. And I like to use Sobo because sometimes I also use fabric, and so this will always work on the fabric and the more porous materials. I also quite often use cyanoacrylate or super glue, and this I'm having a hard time with that word today, cyanoacrylate and hot glue are some of your little bit faster methods of using glue, but you can also buy, for the super glue, you can use accelerator and debonder. So you can actually buy a debonder so that if you glue your fingers together, you can separate them again, or separate two pieces of things that you actually already glued together. And you can also buy an accelerator. So it's a spray that you can spray onto the place that you've already put the super glue, and it'll instantly cure it. Another thing you can do is put some of that down and then apply super glue and touch the pieces together, and as soon as they contact the accelerant, they will automatically cure very quickly. So any of these glues can be useful and you can use, although these ones are much more long lasting and make a better result. The hot glue can get kind of messy, and so can the super glue. Cyanoacrylate can end up giving you puddles of plastic, as well as the hot glue can give you puddles of plastic, which can make a different surface to paint on and take paints differently. It is also useful to apply these in a very thin, even manner. And one of the things that you can do is use an applicator bottle that, of course, I clogged. But if you use an applicator bottle, you can go ahead and apply a nice thin line of glue, and they come with this little plastic thing that you can use to cover them so that they won't get clogged, like so, or sometimes I clean them out with a piece of wire. And it'll allow you to get a nice, clean, single line of glue wherever you want it to be exactly. The other option that you have is you can put a puddle of glue straight from your glue bottle onto a surface and use a toothpick to apply it to the edge of a piece that you're going to be cutting. And this is a very useful method. Also, toothpicks offer a great slightly detailed round dowel type piece that you can use in model making. So I find toothpicks to be very useful. Although I have regular toothpicks right here with a pointed side on both sides, one of my favorites is this one right here, and it has a little decorative bit on the end, and that is helpful when I'm making banisters or staircases. It gives me something a little bit decorative that'll add to that situation. So these are very useful optional additions to your model making kit, but I find them to be very useful. So those are really the things that are mostly essential, and there's lots of other things that you can use that can be useful. Tape is very useful for taping two pieces together while the glue sets so that you don't have to keep holding things in place. Similarly, these are 1, 2, 3 blocks, and they are very heavy. These heavy blocks are 1, 2, and 3 inches respectively, but the thing that's very useful about it is that they're heavy and they're going to hold things very square. So you can use this to push two pieces together and hold a corner while you're waiting for it to dry, or to hold a piece up that you can use them to keep things together while your glue dries and sets. So they're optional, but also very useful. In addition, I've accumulated over my years of model making super cute little tiny clips and clamps and things like that that can be used to hold things together while I'm waiting. Another thing that is very useful in model making in general is some other bits and bobs as far as materials go. So using wire is very common for me, and I have it in a bunch of different thicknesses so that I can make different items, whether it's a tree or chandelier or something like that. I can make different items that hang or use this to hold things in place. And I also have a slew of other craft materials like beads, which can be very useful for door handles, light fixtures, anything that I happen to come across. So these items, again, are really on a need basis, whether you have something that you're going to need them for. Foamworks also sells some interesting cutters which allow you to make different joints, and I will show you some of those a little bit later. But for example, this one you can place and cut at a 45-degree angle consistently, or you can change this around and make it flat this way if you turn it the other way. And if you do that, you can have this help you make a perfect 90-degree cut. They also sell ones for architecture that create V-grooves in different shapes. So if you're having trouble, sometimes there's a tool that can help you. But in no way are these required model making tools. But if you were to get a little bit farther into model making and you want to save some of your own time, these can be very useful tools. Since you're working with tiny things, it's always nice to have a better grip on stuff. So this is just an assortment of other things that I use when I'm working with tiny items. I have a slew of lovely tweezers, and not just standard tweezers, but ones that come with flat edges, a little bit more pointed, extremely itty bitty pointed, and these will help me to be able to grab onto itty bitty tiny things while I'm gluing, because it can be difficult to hold on to that with my big fingers while I'm trying to hold two pieces together. So for example, if I'm just trying to push these two pieces together here, I can hold that with my tweezers and let the glue set while I'm holding it, and it's a lot easier to do with tweezers than it is with my hands. Also, just handling this guy is just a little bit easier for me to do with tweezers. So also when I get to painting this piece, it's very useful to have a set of tweezers on hand. If you're going to do a lot of wire work, these jewelry pliers are a very useful addition to your kit. And the reason that is that the wire needs to be cut with diagonal cutters or something that's a little bit stronger, and like tweezers, they give you a little bit better grip. I also like the jeweler's pliers because they start as open, and as you compress them, they're on a spring. So they just kind of sit here very at the ready for me to grab something and use them, which I find very useful. I also find these bent nose pliers very useful in general because you can have your hand farther up and really grab little items that are hanging around. So once again, not required, but a useful item nonetheless. There are lots of other marking and measuring tools that can prove useful, like compasses or calipers if you need to figure out how big something is. These can be useful, but again, aren't necessary and are often in my kit because it's something that I have anyway. Something that is very useful in addition to rulers of different sizes are right angle tools. I have some plastic ones, but I also have some metal ones that I can use against my knife. And I want to say that I do have a lot of items that I use from other hobbies, such as quilting. So this one is a 2-inch clear see-through ruler and a few of these right angle items that allow me to make better cuts, and a cutting mat that spins, which I find useful for model making sometimes, but sometimes the spinning is a little bit too distracting. Now, one of the things I will point out is that these are from a different hobby, and one of the things they have are these little vinyl double-coated tissue tape items, which allow you to have, they're a little sticky dot, which you can put on the back of these clear see-through rulers so that they will stick where you want them to be. It's essentially putting clear cork back on these rulers so that they won't shift. You want to keep in mind that your knives will still cut into the edges of these see-through items, so it's not a great idea to continue using them as cutting implements, but you can prevent them from sliding when you use them on surfaces. And my cat would like to say hello. And that is not the end of our discussion of items, so I'm going to have to kick my cat out and go back to so that's about it for extra cutting implements. You can use things from other hobbies, and it's a lot, model making is a lot of guerrilla problem solving. So whatever it is that you have a problem that you want to fix, using those items are a good idea. Use them. The only difference is you want to keep in mind what keeps your tools safe while using your tools, and see if you can find a way to make sure that stays happening. All right, so the last but not least is paint. So I use joint compound quite frequently, which can be bought pretty inexpensively and watered down, and it comes out of a lot of things because it's pretty water soluble. And then sandpaper to sand that down. If you don't have sandpaper available, I like to use an emery board or a nail file. So the really cheap ones are great for taking down pieces of a model, either straight up taking down your crescent board or filing down your dry joint compound. For painting, not only do I have a slew of tiny brushes, which I find very useful for tiny things, I actually have several larger brushes. These are useful for creating graining texture and and covering large amounts of surface at one time. And a fan brush is great for creating different lined textures, whether that's grain or some other things. I also like to use a dip pen. Again, something that I use in other artistic endeavors that I find very useful in model making if I want to be very precise about where I put certain bits. If I don't want to be precise, but I want lots of bits, I also use an old toothbrush. No, I do not brush my teeth with this toothbrush. But I use this, I put watered down paint right on this edge and then flick in order to create spatter or big textural surfaces. And that is the tour of the essential items and the other things that you're going to see me using in the course of these videos. But essentially, you need something to attach material to another material. You need something to cut that material with, and extra blades to make sure that you are always using safe and sharp tools. You need a corkback ruler in order to cut against. You need material to cut, and you need a marking utensil. Although there are lots of different things here that you could use, these are the most essential things that you're going to need to start building a model. So now we're going to get started with a little bit of how to do some cutting, some basic cutting techniques. Most of our materials that we looked at come in larger sheets. So this is a larger sheet of 99 crescent board, which is a 1/16 of an inch thick and works really well for 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch scale items. And so I'm going to start with cutting this. Now I'm going to cut off a slice so that we can do something with it and do some demonstrations. So I could, because I'm cutting off a slice for no particular reason, but it doesn't have to be a particular size, a lot of the time I'll cut off a chunk and cut it freehand or just without measuring to start. So like, for instance, this cut edge is not square. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab a spot and just cut without looking at measurements. And we'll talk about being more accurate with your measurements in just a second. But when you're cutting, one of the most common misconceptions with a X-Acto knife or a hobby knife or a Alpha knife or a breakable blade knife is that you try and cut with the blade fully pressing down on the material, as in flat against it. And you can see here, I mean cutting at this angle right here. Trying to cut like this will be very, very difficult. Every point on the knife is contacting with the material, and that means that you get a high amount of friction between the blade and the material you're trying to cut through. That high amount of friction just makes it more difficult to cut. So you actually want to cut up on an angle, something a little bit more like this. And depending on whether you're trying to get a really precise cut, you'll get higher on that angle so that you're just cutting with the tiniest point of your knife and really able to get into a corner. So when I'm cutting here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and create I'm not going to try and get through this in one cut. First of all, if you try and get through this in one cut, what can happen is that it really institutes pushing very, very hard. And if I'm trying to pull and push hard, what happens is my hand will start to shake. And that lack of control is what might allow you to slip. Even when I'm cutting a relatively arbitrary cut, I want to use a corkback ruler. And I want to use that because the ruler doesn't slide. If I use a normal ruler and I try and hold on to it, it's going to slide very easily. This one is not going to slide. Well, this one will. Now, if you try real hard, this will slide. If you're not real careful, that will slide. So it does take a little bit of practice of straight downward pressure. The other thing is, instead of just trying to hold it in one spot, you want to move your fingers wide. Be careful that you don't have your finger over the edge, because that's, where your blade's going to go. You don't want that there. So try and put your hands inside, aim for about the center of this ruler, get your hand nice and wide, and do firm downward pressure. This firm downward pressure is also up against the material you're cutting. One thing we didn't mention in materials was that you should consider what you're cutting on. You can use a self-healing mat like I have right here for any type of craft or hobby that you can get at any craft or hobby store. And you can also use a cutting board or some sort of other sacrificial material. And you can put a piece of foam core under this and just be careful not to cut all the way through it. So here, what we're going to do is I'm going to make one not too hard, not too deep cut, but I'm just going to make one cut. So there's just one score right here. And what that does is it kind of creates a valley. That first cut in my material creates a small valley that instead of trying to cut all the way through, I'm just trying to make this the neatest valley in the correct place that I can. And when I do that, each subsequent cut will want to be inside that valley, even if it's not quite perfectly straight. That first initial cut is going to help me make my other cuts a lot straighter. So I'm going to come back in and do another cut. And again, I'm going to push, but not too hard. I don't want to overstress my fingers. I want to let the blade do a lot of that work. The other part is I want to make sure my blade is very straight up and down. With the camera directly above where I'm cutting, you can see that my blade stays straight up and down, and I'm free. So it only took about 3 cuts to get all the way through. That last one went straight to the mat. I could feel that I didn't have any resistance anymore. And that nice straight cut is also pretty 90 degree because I kept it nice and straight up and down. But I'm going to go ahead and show you what would happen if I didn't do that. So if I cut inward like this, I can get, you can see here that it's not quite a 90-degree cut. I have quite a bit of an angle on that piece, and if I tilt it up, you can see that there's an angle cutting this way on that 90 degree. So instead of being nice and flat like that, it cuts inward. And again, that's a very small difference, but it can add up. Another thing you can do accidentally, and I'm going to exaggerate it a little bit, is going out like this. And if you cut all the way through your material on that angle, you can see in the opposite direction that you can see some of the inside of the crescent board. And again, you get a cut that is not quite 90 degrees. This cut ends up slicing this way instead of going straight back. Now, why does that matter? It can make your seams when you come together not so pretty. So if you push them up against each other, it can end up having a gap or something that you would need to fill with joint compound or glue or some other method. And although some of that will happen, the neater and straighter you can get your cuts, the better. So here, if I go ahead and try again, one of the things I'm going to show you is that if you get that first cut nice and straight, and then your other cuts to the side this way, and an accidental cut this way as well, I'm going to show you that these 3 are almost a 1/16 of an inch wide on their own. So this space that it creates is almost a full width of the mat board, which means that's 3 inches in 1/4 inch scale or 1.5 inches in 1/2 inch scale, give or take, and that's going to add to your margin of error. So cutting straight down also gives you the most precise cuts that you can. So as you're cutting, again, if you get up to about 5 or 6, taking about 5 or 6 cuts to get through this material, you probably need to change your blade. It's probably too dull. There, I did that one in 2. When I use this longer blade, I actually don't need it out very long in order to get through the mat board. I'm going to go ahead and pull it in and do 2 cuts nice and easy and get all the way through that material. If you need to change out your blade in your Alpha knife, you would pull it out the bottom and change out your blade with a new one. And on your X-Acto knife, you want to unscrew here and pull this out. Remember to dispose of your blades safely in a sharps container or another container so that you're not throwing them directly into your trash can. It can be very difficult to know that something in there is extra sharp. So your mat board, you don't want to cut, you want to try and cut straight up and down, but you also want to try and be as exact as possible. So that's where this mat can come in pretty handy. If I know I want to cut 1/4 inch, this dot up here and this dot down here will allow me to line that up perfectly straight and line this edge up perfectly straight here so that I get a really good idea of the size of that piece before I cut it. I was trying to look up at the camera instead of just down, so I made a mistake here, which leads me to remind you that one of the good rules of thumb that you can use is, if at all possible, for the piece that you want to keep, the piece that you actually want to use, try and make it underneath the ruler, because that's the piece that's protected. So if you make a mistake and you do this, you're doing it on the piece you don't need. You want to push up against the ruler and go in a nice even pace up against that surface, but you don't need to push hard up against it. You don't need to deflect your blade up against that material. What do I mean by that? I mean, you don't have to do this. You don't want to put that much pressure on it where you can see the blade deflecting. If you're doing that, it's because you're not right in front of the cut. So you want to move the thing that you're cutting, or move yourself, so that you are directly in front of that cut, and it becomes a much easier cut to make, so that your arm is over it. It's also, if you have a particularly high place that you're cutting, you want to try and either stand up or move yourself so that you can put your weight over the top of that side and let the weight of your arm push down, rather than trying to push with your hand or your fingers, which will be a lot more difficult. So if you're cutting crescent board, that's not so bad. And if you're cutting foam core, that's very similar to mat board and any of our thicker papers. But one of the things you want to keep in mind if you're cutting foam core is that foam core is a little bit different in makeup than our papers. Foam core has a paper front, a paper back, and foam in its core. And so cutting this one should always take about 3 cuts. And what I mean by that is you're going to do your cut through the paper on the top, just kind of like a valley. So you're just trying to get through one set of paper, and then sink your blade in and go through the foam, and then sink your blade in again and go through the paper on the other side. So that creates a nice clean edge. If for some reason when you're cutting you end up with something that looks like it's been chewed by a small animal, that it does this and you feel a lot of dragging, something like that, that comes from unless you've sculpted it yourself for demonstration purposes, that comes from a dull blade. And I do want to point out that particularly with foam core, dulling blades happen very quickly. Cutting through the foam releases some chemicals that start to then eat your blade. So you will actually go through a lot more blades cutting through this material than you will this material, even though this material feels a lot harder and denser to cut through, and this feels a lot lighter. There's a lot less resistance. So the other thing you can do is you can, if you cut in this way or learn to cut in this way on foam core, not only can you cut a piece directly out, you can cut through the paper, sink down into the foam and cut just through the foam, but don't cut through the paper on the other side. And when you take this up, now you have something that you can turn. So now you can do 2 walls next to each other. This is useful for some quick and dirty models, as well as some just throwing some things together and seeing how it might look. You know that all your walls are going to be the same size, and then you can make slices and cut them and bend them into shape so that you get an idea of what a box set might look like. Another thing you can do is you can mark off the width of this piece, and you can make another corner, and you can make that other corner by coming in and once again cutting through the paper, cutting through the foam. But instead of just opening it, which you can open it as well, come in here and kind of fillet it open and pull this out. And that's going to leave us this lovely piece that you can add a rabbet joint, and you can add another piece coming this way. So this makes a nice, clean, perfect joint. Another thing or another thing you can do is actually buy a cutter that will do that joint for you. So there are lots of specialty cutters out there, as well as cutters manufactured for mat board that will give you an automatic 45 degrees, a chamfered edge, or a straight line. So this one right here is set up to cut a straight line by setting the depth of your blade to the depth of your material, and then riding, put that away so I don't cut through my mat, riding across it like this on this flat surface, and then you know you're cutting a straight line. It also, you can undo this screw and flip this base around, and now you'll be able to cut a 45 degree reliably. And you can put it on either side of the cutter so that you can cut a 45 this way or the other way. But that'll allow you to ride along that flat surface and cut a 45 degree if you'd like to. This one has two blades buried inside of it here. And you can see along this edge that not only does it have a blade going straight down this way, it has a blade going across this way. And what that is for is that instead of hand cutting this rabbet joint, you can take it and slide it through here, and it will automatically cut that piece for you. It'll automatically cut that groove. And now you can have a perfectly cut edge every time. And it'll make a nice, perfect joint for you. Some of these cutters are really useful, but they aren't necessary. They'll save you time, but only if you're doing a lot of these cuts in a row. You can also buy a V-groove that'll allow you to cut something in the middle and allow you to make that turn in, instead of cut a V channel right there. So instead of cutting the opposite way, it'll allow you to turn a corner in this way. If you're going to do that, obviously you want to use, not freehand it like I just did, or it will end up being either going through your paper, like I just cut, or be a little messy. So that reminds me that when you're cutting, you always want to be as accurate as you possibly can. So by that, I mean that you want to lay out your pieces and lay out your measurements, and generally you're going to use a scale ruler to make sure you're staying in the scale that you are using, and you're being very accurate. But you want to make sure to be accurate on both sides. I'm going to use this pen because I don't think you're going to be able to see those pencil marks. And you don't necessarily need to make a mark on both sides and then connect it with a line. If you don't connect it with a line, you can just connect it with your ruler. But just like when you're thinking about when you were drawing with a ruler, kind of kindergarten style, you have a surface, and then you have the cork back of the ruler, and then you have the metal surface of the ruler. Whatever mark you make here and where you put your knife is not going to be right on the edge of that. You need the thickness of your blade coming off of it. So you actually want to set your ruler directly next to where you've made your marks, instead of on top of it. So similar to just like the accommodation you would make as if you were, right the first time, the accommodation that you would make as if you were drawing that line with a pen is the same one that you want to make when you're cutting with a knife. So I want to line that up real carefully and cut along that line. When you're talking about itty-bitty things, you want to be as accurate as you possibly can. So making sure you have a mark on both sides, double checking your measurements, using a long enough ruler to reach all the way to your edge is going to be beneficial. If you're using a grid, you can use this to help you keep things square. Keep things lined up on the square on the mat from factory edge to your cut edge, or factory edge to factory edge. You can use the mat itself to do measurements like this. I'm going to use it to cut a 1/4 inch strip. So I'm going to line it up to the dots up there and the dots on the bottom. But you want to be very careful that you're being as accurate as you possibly can. And using the mat underneath will be slightly less accurate than measuring it out yourself. But for something like this, I'm usually cutting this to make support strips for the back sides of my pieces. So that accuracy is going to be within the tolerance of what I'm looking for. In addition to that, you can use some other items if you don't have a mat like this, or if you want to keep it really accurate, and that can include triangles in order to mark some stuff out, or metal triangles that you can make some marks on. In my materials demonstration, I showed you a couple of other things I have from other hobbies. These are from sewing and quilting, and although they look the same on this side, this one has these clear bumpers on the back, and this one does not. So what that means is that when I lay this one down, it slides real easily, and when I lay this one down, it doesn't. It does eventually, if I really push, it'll slide, but it takes a lot more effort to push this one, so I can push it straight down instead of having it slide, and then I can cut up against it. I want to be careful though, because even though this is thick acrylic, my knife will still gouge into the edge of this. So it's not super ideal to be using this for the edge of a cut. But by making sure that I have these rubber stoppers, I can make that cut a lot safer. So if you do want to use something like, also this plastic is a lot harder than this plastic that we usually use for drafting. These also are designed to have some chamfers on the edge so that when you're drawing, you don't get lead dragged across your surface. And these do not have that. So they have a flat surface all the way down to the bottom. But this can help you keep things square to mark things up before you cut. And it does also have the advantage of having your lines on the edge there. So if you're very careful and you slide your blade right down across the edge here, you can cut with something that isn't a metal cork back roller, but you want to make sure that you take the precautions to still cut safely. I didn't cut all the way through the top, but that's a nice smooth 90-degree cut. All right, so that is most of your cutting. That doesn't take into account some of the math that you'll need to put things together, but this way you can cut bigger pieces into little pieces so that we can glue them back together to make big pieces. Once you've cut your material from a big piece down into a bunch of little pieces, and you're going to put them together to make a big thing, this time hopefully a 3-dimensional thing, you need to glue it together. So there's lots of different options for glue, and we're going to talk about a few of them now. What is in my little glue applicator bottle right here is Sobo with a little bit of water to keep it moving. And that helps me to be able to use it to distribute in nice, fine, thin lines. Another thing you can do is just take a scrap piece of something and open up your glue bottle, put some glue right on that surface, and then use a toothpick or even another scrap of the pieces you're using, like a scrap like this, to pick some up, put it on the edge of a piece, and glue it to another edge. Now you want to try and keep your glue pretty neat to the edge of that item. And then push and hold nice and tight until that gets set. So this is a fun part where we just sit here and we wait for our glue to tack up. And if we let go too early, it could just fall apart. If we wait a nice amount of time, it'll stick together. It's not cured yet. We shouldn't pick that up and start throwing it around, but it will stay pretty tightly together. Another thing we can do is use cyanoacrylate in order, or super glue, in order to glue two pieces together. Now, one of the things I like to use this for is that if you have a paper or a card, a piece of furniture or something like that, and you essentially coat it in this glue, it will end up being stronger. So
going to spread some of this out. So if I make a piece of itty bitty furniture that's out of a relatively thin material, and I coat that itty bitty piece of furniture in super glue or cyanoacrylate, you're going to get a much stiffer piece of furniture. And you want to smooth it out so that it's not a solid piece of plastic when it dries. And you want to avoid any voids in the surface. But that super glue will dry. It'll make everything a little bit shiny, and it usually dries pretty quickly. If you want to make it dry faster, you can use the accelerator and make it dry faster. It's also one of the glues that will allow you to glue metal to non-metal surfaces. So I can glue wire to the crescent board, or I can glue something else that I'm looking to attach to my standard model, like beads or something like that. The super glue will give me a little bit more flexibility in being able to glue what I want to the other thing that I want. Now, as this starts to dry here, what you can see is that this bends a little more stiffly than if I bend over here. And that strength can help with some of your thinner materials when you're putting them together. Generally, I don't use it to glue two pieces of crescent board together because it can get a little runny and a little messy, and I do not want to glue my fingers together. But it's similar to what we did before. You're just going to press and hold until that glue has a chance to set up. This particular glue, they all have different cure times. You can buy super glue with different cure times. And this one is a 10 to 25 second cure. So it's a bit faster than that one. The high point of that is that after those 10 to 25 seconds, it's pretty darn secure. As opposed to this one where you don't want to pick it up and start flouncing it around too soon. This one is now quite solid. This one is still soupy. So even though we did that one first, still a little soupy. Now this one will eventually strengthen up to be equal to, if not stronger than this one. So it's not like it's not the thing we want to use. But also, super glue is much more expensive. Cyanoacrylate is much more expensive. So it's going to be a lot more to buy this and the accelerant and use it to glue all your models together. It also becomes brittle over time and it'll snap. So this one will actually be stronger over time a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this joint back up and put a little bit more glue in there because we pulled it apart, and instead of using what I used before, I'm going to use my little applicator instead of using my piece, but you could also use a toothpick to apply this. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to do that, and instead of sitting here and holding for a long period of time, I'm going to come in, I'm going to wipe off this excess just because I don't need it. And then I'm going to take a little bit of hot glue and I'm going to put it right in the inside, bridging across those two. And you can do the same thing. You can spread this out. You can leave them in two little bubbles, but obviously you want to put those on the wrong side of the joint so that they're not visible. And you can basically use that to tack this in place, to hold it in place while the white glue dries, while the Sobo, the white glue, the tacky glue, while those dry. You can also take a piece of tape and put it across that surface. You want to try and use painter's tape or a low tack masking tape, otherwise you're going to damage the surface and it's not as easily paintable. But essentially, if you wait for the hot glue to get cool, and you can then immediately handle this piece, and it can take a little bit more abuse than it could with just the white glue. So using a combination of the hot glue and the white glue is usually how I go about gluing things together. If I need to glue strange things together, I'll either use the super glue, cyanoacrylate, or I'll use hot glue. Some things are only attachable with hot glue. And by some things, I really mean acetate. So projection material or acetate is a great surface to use to take advantage of its transparent nature, but really the only thing that attaches to this is hot glue. So I'm going to clean up the strings on this hot glue and then press this chair down. And this is how I usually use this, so that I take it and I can cut this square out, and now this chair will stand on its own no matter what surface I put it on. This is especially useful if I'm trying to make an arrangement such as this. Thought I ran into my hot glue there for a second, but I didn't. I ran into regular glue. This is a table, 2 chairs, and a stool on a piece of acetate, so that I don't have to set up this furniture over and over again. And when I'm working on my model or taking pictures of it, I can go ahead and set up each separate arrangement and take pictures or change it out in the middle of rehearsal without worrying about all my furniture pieces falling over or making a big mess. So I use a combination of hot glue, white glue, and super glue, but there are lots of other adhesives out there. Another thing is that if you want to glue wire to wire, and as I mentioned, I use some wire materials quite often, you are in a little bit of a bind. The best way to do that is to solder it together. Also using brass, soldering that together is going to be your best call. So that's another way to glue something without actually using glue. But some super glues and hot glues will work in those situations, but they're mostly just encasing those two pieces together, not actually gluing them in any significant way. So those pieces can't take a large amount of stress. Now, if you want to glue foam, for example, to foam, it's probably a good idea to use white glue or hot glue. Your super glue is probably going to eat right through it. You want to be careful, though, that with especially your hot glue, you're as neat and careful as possible. Particularly because hot glue can be messy, what I like to do is, if this is my perfect side, I'm going to take my pieces and lay them like this, and then roll them into the gap so that any squeeze out that happens on the ugly side. So that would be right there. Like if there's anything that pushes out, it pushes out on that ugly side. And then this side ends up perfect. Another example of that would be if I'm putting the back of a theater on a theater box, right? I have this piece and I want to put it here. I want to pay attention to, is this the pretty side or is this the pretty side? So if I apply my hot glue, you want to try and not over apply the hot glue. And if that side is my pretty side, I want to set that down right there and then roll it up so the excess squeezes out the back and not the front where I want it to stay pretty. And I would do exactly the opposite if that is what I wanted. If I wanted this side to be pretty, I'd lay my glue down and start over here and roll up the other way. And that way all the squeeze out will come out this side. Generally, you can avoid that by, if you notice over here, I kept the glue nice and light, and I added a little bit more glue over here to get myself some squeeze out to show you what was going on. By just keeping less glue, it's going to work out a little bit better. And that is about it for gluing. So let's talk about how to accommodate for the thickness of your material coming out. Alrighty then. So we figured out how to cut bigger pieces into little pieces and glue those pieces back together into larger pieces. But now we need to talk about how to make sure those pieces are exactly what you want. So what do I mean by that? I mean that anytime that you're creating a piece, you want a thing when you're done, because you're creating something. So let's say you want a 2x2 cube. and I mean all the directions to be 2 inches by 2 inches by 2 inches. 2 inches. So all of them to be 2 inches, right? So if you just cut out a bunch of 2 inch by 2 inch squares, so this is perfectly, one of these squares is an inch, so 1, 2, 1, 2, perfect 2 inch squares. So it should be perfect that once I glue all these together, I'm going to get a 2 inch square. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy, no big deal. So if I were to glue these together, one of the things you'll notice if you're thinking spatially about it is that this will happen. If I put these two on each side, it is now a 1/16 of an inch bigger on both sides, because a 1/16 of an inch is the thickness of this material. So in 1/4 inch scale, that's 3 inches. In 1/2 inch scale, that's 1.5 inches. Either way, that's significantly different. So, and it's adding to both sides of this piece. So if I glue these together like this, okay, but then what would I do when I get to the side over here? I have to make a choice. I'm going to go ahead and just tack this together for demonstration purposes. So I have this one like this. So if I glue it together like that, if you're saying, hey, why aren't you gluing all the way across the side? Spoiler alert, we're doing this wrong. Or at least wrong to get a 2 foot by 2 foot cube. So once I have that, this 2 inch by 2 inch cube, this is not 2 inches. This is not what would be 4 feet in 1/2 inch scale or 8 feet in 1/4 inch scale. This is now significantly bigger than that. And that can be a problem. So if we were making this in 1/2 inch scale, it is now 4 foot 3 inches. If we were making this in 1/4 inch scale, it is now 8 foot 6 inches. And if we were making this in 1/8 inch scale, this is now 14 foot 6 instead of, whoop, I read the wrong one. This is now 17 foot 6 instead of 17 feet even. So it's vastly a different size in scale, and we want to be as accurate as we possibly can. The other problem we're going to encounter is that this right here, if we put it in like this, it's going to be too big for our other side. This is not going to come together. This is not going to end up coming together to make a cube that's square. We're going to end up squeezing things in different places and pushing things out, and it's just not going to come together. Our pieces aren't going to match up, and they aren't going to sit on top here. So what are we going to do? Well, we have to decide how we want to put it together in order to figure out how big each piece should be. So what do I mean? I mean that let's look at the top and the bottom. Let's say that when we make this cube, we want to do the top and the bottom as perfect cubes. So this piece right here will be a true 2 inches by 2 inches, the thickness of the material. So we have a top and a bottom, and we're going to take the top and the bottom, and these are true 2 by 2 and 2 by 2, and we're going to set those aside. We're going to make this the top, and we're going to make this the bottom. So what's left is 4 sides. So if we just look at those 4 sides as a 2 by 2 inch square and a true 2 by 2 inch square, what's happening is that the height of it needs to be not 2 inches. In order to make it 2 inches, we need to take the thickness of the material out here and here. So we want to reduce the size. Instead of making it 2 inches by 2 inches, we want to reduce the height by 2 thicknesses. And one of the reasons I call this a thickness is because when you're working in this material, the thickness is 1/16 of an inch, which is one of these ticks on a corkback metal ruler. So it's very easy for me to look at this and say 2 ticks. So if you're looking at 1 thickness, 2 thicknesses, that's 2 thicknesses or 2 ticks. So I'm going to take 2 ticks off of that. So when I'm measuring, instead of actually measuring and thinking to myself that I need 1 inch and 14/16, which is a little weird to think of to go to right here. I just think of I need 2 inches minus 2 ticks, and that's where I'm going to make this measurement. So I'm going to do 2 inches from the 4 to the 2 minus 2 ticks. You can do the same thing over here, minus 2 ticks, and then I'll be able to cut this piece, and this piece will fit vertically between those two. So now this piece plus these two are going to equal the 2 inches that we want. So this piece is short, it won't make it, but we'll take the bottom and the top, and once we get the hot glue off that we put on there a second ago, we'll sandwich these two together, and this sandwich will make perfect 2 inch by 2 inch cube. So that's how we know that that measurement is correct. Now, if you look at it from the top instead of the side, what we want to figure out is how big this is right here. So if we look at it from a top view, and we make that piece the full 2 inches, it goes all the way across. And let's say we make the next one over here 2 inches. That means if this side piece is a full 2 inches and then the height of it is minus 2 thicknesses, then we'll need to put them across from each other, and these two pieces on this side will need to be the width now minus 2 ticks. So minus the thickness on this side and minus the thickness on this side. So this piece over here, this side piece, is going to be a height of 2 inches minus 2 thicknesses, and the width is actually going to be 2 inches minus 2 thicknesses. Now, one of the things that happens to me a lot whenever I'm doing a box like this is that I accidentally mix up the short side and the long side. They're all the same height, but 2 of them are longer and go here, and 2 of them are shorter and go there. And what happens is I accidentally mix them up, and I put a long one right next to a long one, and it gets a little messy. So one of the things I like to do is, instead of doing a long, a short, a short, I just take 1 thickness off and stagger them. So this side is, instead of 2 inches, it's 2 inches minus 1 thickness, right? And this one is the same. So it's going to stop here. It's going to come over and it's going to stop here. And this one up here is going to come down and stop there. So by staggering them in one another, the actual pieces are all cut the same size. So the actual pieces are all 2 inches tall minus 2 thicknesses, and 2 inches wide minus 1 thickness. Now, if you're thinking what I'm thinking, it's now going to be very easy to turn them topsy-turvy, and that is true. And there's not much I can do to prevent that, except I can point up or down. So right now, this is the up and down direction. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to put that to tell me which side is up and down. Yep. So I'm going to come in and I need 4 total of these pieces, and right now they're 2 by 2. So I'm going to flip them upside down and mark them so I know which way they're going. This one's already cut. And it's cut this way. So I can put those two on top of each other. And that's how big I want that guy to be. Now I'm gonna double check that and make sure it's 2 thicknesses. Yep. And then I'm gonna trim it down. And then the other direction, I'm gonna take 1 thickness off. And yes, I should measure that carefully. And so should you. So this one needs 1 thickness off here. So I'm going to do the same over here. Now, generally when I'm doing this, I don't actually take off the thicknesses. I don't actually measure them like this or mark them like this and take off the thicknesses after they've already been constructed. I just think about their construction before I cut them out and then proceed to actually cut them out correctly the first time. But I wanted to show you what this would look like. Sometimes when I'm marking, what I'm doing right now is instead of marking with a pencil or a pen, I'm carefully lining it up and then marking with my knife by putting a little point with the tip of my blade. It just makes a small indent that I can see. So this one, once again, it doesn't actually matter if I've been cutting them from the front because I guess I'm used to it, but it doesn't actually matter. I can mark and cut them on the back. And it is easier to see my mark, so maybe I should do that. But as I told you, I don't normally mark them like this and then cut them. I usually just mark them correctly and build them from there. But there are plenty of times where I make a mistake or I don't think it all the way through and I have to look at what my physical measurements are and build part of my item and then make a correction. I don't know if you noticed that, but I just fixed my X-Acto knife because it does sometimes tend to come loose. And you want to be real cautious about that. You don't want a loose blade. You're pushing something, you're dragging it through material. You don't want a loose blade hanging around. So once I have all these pieces made, I'm going to assemble them. So I'm going to make sure I'm conscious of my up and down. And I'm going to make a line right here. And put my 2 pieces together with the up and down together. And I'm going to go ahead and do a quick little hot glue dot on the inside. Before my hot glue dries, I'm going to double check that my corner is still nice and clean looking, and it is. Try and hold it nice and square. Another thing you can do is this is a good time to use your blocks to assemble these pieces. Particularly, I can place one here and force it to stand upright so that it's nice and tightly packed together. I don't really need to do this at this point because I have that hot glue cooling right in that corner to hold it together. But since this comes over into that corner and this doesn't come all the way to the end, this one's going to go all the way to the end. So I'm going to come in and glue this piece with the up and down arrows the same. One of the ways you can tell that you might have messed up or that you're not, if I go off my excess, and that you're not lined up is that the height, they're currently a 1/16 of an inch different this way than this way. So if I were to turn this sideways, if I didn't make those marks, then I would be able to figure that out pretty quickly. I'm going to set this down like had it right the first time. Lose focus for 1 minute. Excuse me while I stick my head in here just to get that hot glue in that corner. And then my last one will sit on top of here and go on this inside edge. Okay. So another thing I can do besides wipe up my excess glue is I can also tape these pieces together, which can be quite useful. Also, if you want to tape a few pieces together and you have a joint that comes together, you can plan that out and tape them together as well. I'll show you that in just a second. But what we'll do here is we'll just take a little piece, make sure we're nice and lined up, and this tape will keep it together. While we glue the top and the bottom on. Now, although it can sometimes be annoying that your glue comes undone, it can also be very enjoyable if you glued something incorrectly and have to take it apart real quick and put it back together. You have a little time to worry about that. So the top and the bottom don't actually need to be one. Doesn't actually matter which one is which, but I'll take a line of glue and set this one here. Wipe off my excess, flip it over, do the same over here. And now is another good time for the 1, 2, 3 block, because we can take this and stick it right here, and that will apply some pressure to our piece. Let's say we want to glue these two pieces together, and I want them to glue together like this. What I can do is I can dry fit them together, so I can set them together without any glue, which is exactly what dry fitting sounds like. So I'm going to take them together, and I'm going to go ahead and tape them together without any glue. Then I'm going to open that joint back up, and I'm going to put glue into that joint. So I want it to fold up like this, so I'm going to want to put glue on this surface of this square. And then I'm going to fold that piece into place. And you can do that with all 4 sides of the cube so that they roll up in the right direction. And again, if I want that to stay stable, I can also use the hot glue to keep it in place while I'm waiting. This is also a good example of a weight or a block of some kind, because this one is sitting on top of this one. If I set it like this, and I set it like that, then this will stay here, and that corner will stay at 90 degrees. And then when this is dry, I can pull those away. You don't have to use exactly these blocks, but they're nice because they're machined to be a perfect square. You want to be careful that when you're gluing stuff together, you're paying attention to whether or not it's square. Right here is a lot less square than this one that I glued together. And that means if I try and put this together into a larger piece, it might be difficult to get there. Now, there is a little bit of flexibility while the glue is still wet that you can open that joint back up, but sometimes that can crack the glue in there. So especially if you're using hot glue or super glue, that becomes very brittle once it's fully cured, and you'll end up snapping that instead of actually adjusting your seam or your joint. Alright, so now that you know how to glue stuff together and do your math, you should be able to create anything you like.